Okay, welcome back. We're in Chapter 17, Section 2, beginning on page 522. The title of this is Radicals in Control, American Diary. For 3 days in May 1866, white mobs in Memphis, Tennessee burned African American churches, schools, and homes. An Army officer investigating the causes of the riot later reported, quote, 3 African American churches were burned. Also, about 50 private dwellings owned, occupied, or inhabited by freedmen as homes, and in many instances containing the hard earnings of months of labor. From reports of outrages, riots, and murders, January 15, 1866, August 12, 1868, by Colonel Charles F. Johnson. African Americans' rights. Main idea. When Northerners realized that African Americans in the South were still being mistreated, they worked to find a way to help them. History and you. Think about the rights American citizens have. Read to find out how Congress made sure that formerly enslaved African Americans became citizens. Many Northerners saw that the Memphis riot as an attempt by whites to terrorize African Americans and keep them from enjoying and practicing their new freedoms. The Memphis incident and similar riots in other southern cities helped convince or persuade radical Republicans that President Johnson's Reconstruction plan was not strong enough. During the fall of 1865, southern states created new governments based on Johnson's plan. They also elected new representatives to Congress. When the southern representatives arrived in Washington, D.C., however, Congress refused to seat them. Many Republicans refused to readmit the southern states on such easy terms. Black codes. By early 1866, southern states had passed black codes, or laws to control freed men and women. The black codes trampled the rights of African Americans. They allowed plantation owners to exploit African American workers and allowed officials to arrest and fine jobless African Americans. The codes also banned African Americans from owning or renting farms. To freed men and women and many Northerners, the black codes resembled slavery. In early 1866, Congress passed a bill giving the Freedmen's Bureau new powers. The agency could now set up special courts to try individuals charged with violating the rights of African Americans. African Americans could also serve on juries in these courts. Congress then passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This act granted full citizenship to African Americans and gave the federal government the power to intervene in state affairs to protect their rights. The law overturned the black codes. It also contradicted the 1857 Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court, which had ruled that African Americans were not citizens. President Johnson vetoed both bills. He argued that the federal government was overstepping its authority. He also argued that the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and Civil Rights Act were unconstitutional because they were approved by a Congress that did not include representatives from all the states. By raising this issue, Johnson directly threatened to veto any law passed by this Congress. Republicans in Congress had enough votes to override or defeat both vetoes, and the bills became law. The chance of the President and Congress working together faded. The radical Republicans abandoned the idea of compromise and drafted a new Reconstruction plan, one created by Congress. The 14th Amendment. Fearing that the Civil Rights Act might be overturned in court, Congress passed a new amendment to the Constitution in 1866. The 14th Amendment was enacted in 1868. It granted full citizenship to all people born in the United States. Because most African Americans in the United States had been born in the country, they became full citizens. The amendment also stated that no state could take away a citizen's life, liberty, or property without due process of law. In addition to this, every citizen was entitled to equal protection of the laws. If a state prevented any adult male citizen from voting, then it could lose some of its representation in Congress. The amendment also barred former Confederate leaders from holding national or state office unless pardoned by Congress. The 14th Amendment also excluded Native Americans from citizenship. Congress declared that southern states had to ratify the amendment to rejoin the Union. Of the 11 southern states, only Tennessee ratified it. The refusal of the other southern states to ratify delayed the amendment's adoption until 1868. Republican victory. In the congressional elections of 1866, President Johnson campaigned vigorously against the radical Republicans. Many Northerners objected to the nasty tone of Johnson's campaign and feared clashes between whites and African Americans. The Republicans won a solid victory, giving Congress the signal to take Reconstruction into its own hands. Reading check, explaining why did Johnson consider the Civil Rights Bill unconstitutional? Radical Reconstruction, main idea. Radical Republicans were able to put their version of Reconstruction into action. History and you. If you were a member of Congress at this time, what changes would you like to see in a Reconstruction plan? Read to find out how the radical Republicans shaped Reconstruction. President Johnson could do little to stop Republicans because they could easily override his vetoes in Congress. Thus began a period known as Radical Reconstruction. Reconstruction Acts of 1867. The first Reconstruction Act passed in 1867 called for the creation of new government in the 10 southern states that had not ratified the 14th Amendment. Tennessee, which ratified, kept its government and rejoined the Union. The act divided the 10 southern states into 5 military districts, each run by a military commander until new governments were formed. The act also guaranteed African American men the right to vote in state elections and banned former Confederate leaders from holding political office. To rejoin the Union, the states had to ratify the 14th Amendment and submit new state constitutions to Congress for approval. A second Reconstruction Act required the military commanders to register voters and prepare for state constitutional conventions. Readmission of states. Many white Southerners refused to take part in the elections for constitutional conventions and state governments. Thousands of newly registered African American voters, however, voted. In the elections, Republicans gained control of the southern state governments. By 1868, 7 southern states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and South Carolina, had established new governments and met the requirements for readmission. By 1870, Mississippi, Virginia, and Texas were restored to the Union. Impeaching the president. Strongly opposed to radical Reconstruction, President Johnson had the power as commander-in-chief to the Army to direct the actions of the military governors. For this reason, Congress passed a series of laws to limit the president's power, such as the Tenure of Office Act. It prohibited the president from removing government officials, including members of its own cabinet, without the Senate's approval. The conflict between Johnson and the radicals grew more intense. In August 1867, when Congress was not in session, Johnson suspended or removed from office temporarily Secretary of War Edwin Stanton without the Senate's approval. When the Senate met again and refused to approve the suspension, Johnson removed Stanton from office. This action was a deliberate violation of the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson also appointed people who the radical Republicans opposed to command some of the southern military districts. Outraged by Johnson's actions, the House of Representatives voted to impeach the president or formally charge him with wrongdoing. In 1868, the case went to the Senate for a trial that lasted almost 3 months. Johnson's defenders claimed that the president was exercising his right to challenge laws he considered unconstitutional. They argued that Congress impeached the president because of politics without accusing him of a crime. Johnson's critics disputed that Congress held supreme power to make the laws and that Johnson's use of the veto improperly interfered with this function. The senators failed to achieve the 2/3 majority required for conviction. Some moderate Republicans supported the president, arguing that Johnson should not be removed from office because of political differences. As a result, Johnson stayed in office until the end of his term in March 1869. The 15th Amendment. By the presidential election of 1868, most southern states had rejoined the Union, and many Americans hoped that Reconstruction was over. Abandoning Johnson, the Republicans nominated Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War hero. The Democrats chose Horatio Seymour. Grant received most of the African American votes in the South and won the presidency. The 1868 election showed that voters supported the Republican approach to Reconstruction. In 1869, Congress passed the 14th Amendment. It prohibited the state and federal governments from denying the right to vote to any male citizen because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. African American men won the right to vote when the amendment was ratified and became law in 1870. Republicans thought the power of the vote would enable African Americans to protect themselves. That belief, however, was too optimistic. Reading check. Explaining. How did Republicans organize the South during Reconstruction? Section 2, review. Vocabulary. Number 1, define the following: convince, block codes, override, suspend, impeach. Main ideas. 2, specifying what requirement was necessary for African Americans to become citizens under the 14th Amendment. Number 3, explaining why was President Johnson unable to stop radical Republicans from putting their Reconstruction plan into action. Okay, that wraps it up for Chapter 17, Section 2.